Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast is your one-stop shop for fantasy football news and advice. Can't decide on who to draft on the first round? Going gaga on how to line up your team. Got you covered. Traditional league, dynasty league, PPR league, IDP league, even daily fantasy football league. Join us as we break down all the questions of fantasy football. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
What is up, everybody, and welcome back. Thank you for tuning into the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your Thursday and Sunday host, Grady Duggan, and I hope you all are having a wonderful day so far. We have a jam-packed show full of things to dive into this episode, so the last thing I want to do is waste too much of our time. We're going to be talking about the new and somewhat shocking signing of Cam Newton to the New England Patriots. So Bill Belichick has a new little toy to play with in his offense. I also mentioned last episode that I was going to be going more in depth about my draft strategy as we inch closer to the fantasy football drafts, as well as talking a little bit about what to expect in a keeper and dynasty league and who are my top players I am targeting in a keeper or dynasty league. So I'm excited to have you guys. Let's get to it. Seeing Adam Schefter of ESPN break the news the other day that Cam Newton was signing to the New England Patriots was an interesting change of events throughout the whole entire NFL. As we entered this offseason with a lot of question marks, two of the biggest stories were, is Tom Brady going to leave the Patriots? And if so, what will Bill Belichick do for the first time in 20 some odd years, not having to have any quarterback controversy or quarterback needs or anything like that? And then also was, if the Panthers are going to be moving on from Cam Newton, where does he end up after being placed on the Carolina Panthers injured reserve list after only 2 games in the 2019 season? One thing that was abundantly clear as Cam Newton began his free agency carousel in a way was that he wanted to be a starter and he wasn't going to settle for anything less, which you can't blame the guy who was the 2015 NFL MVP. He led the Carolina Panthers to the Super Bowl in 2016. And aside from last year where he only played 2 games, he hadn't had a season where he threw under 3,000 yards. So when healthy and in a system that fits him, Cam Newton is a top 10 to top 12 quarterback in my opinion. So as the offseason kind of slowly carried on with everything going on, as the pandemic was still in place, once the draft was over, it was very clear that a lot of teams went with rookie choices as they planned for their future, like the Dolphins with Tua Tagovailoa. There's the Chargers with Justin Herbert. There's obviously the Bengals with Joe Burrow. So there wasn't a lot of starting quarterback openings for Cam Newton. And part of this that is not that surprising is Cam Newton signs a 1-year deal for not that much money. So it kind of looks like this could be a prove-it year for Cam Newton. Let him get his reps in, show the league that he can still play after not playing in 2019. And then next year will really be his big free agent time to cash in and get the money that he, I'm sure, believes he deserves. Where this signing gets a little bit more interesting is throughout this offseason, especially once the Patriots did not take a quarterback in the 2019 NFL Draft, the talk behind Jarrett Stidham really started to heat up. And now Stidham is a second-year guy out of Auburn, and someone who people say the Patriots are extremely high on. They really like him, and Bill Belichick could see him potentially as the future of that franchise. And there's been some talk of whether is Cam Newton really going to be handed the starting job. And Diana Rossini of ESPN tweeted out earlier this week that she spoke with a AFC East head coach, so same division, over text on Cam Newton to the Patriots. And the head coach is quoted, "I think they're going to keep 3 QBs, use Cam Newton perhaps as the wild card. I actually don't see him starting week 1 in the offense. I know one thing for a fact, the Patriots love Jarrett Stidham." And that honestly surprises me. I don't think in a situation that the Patriots are in, Bill Belichick is not going to be tanking. He wants to put out the best possible product to win as many games as possible. I don't think you sign a former MVP with the talent that Cam Newton has to sit on the bench for a second-year guy who is fairly unproven in the NFL. And I'm not taking away anything from Jarrett Stidham. I'm sure that the Patriots are really high on him and he could be the future of that franchise. But I think this is an offense that doesn't have a lot of weapons and doesn't have a lot of things going on offense. I mean, they have Mohamed Sanu and N'Keal Harry at receiver as well as Julian Edelman, but that's just not going to cut it in my opinion, especially they don't have Gronk obviously from retirement and then signing with the Buccaneers. And they do have Sony Michel at running back, who I've talked about before in this podcast, but it's not like Jarrett Stidham would have a lot of weapons going into his first full year as a starter. So someone with the talent that Cam Newton has, he can run around, he can be kind of productive in the pocket, also has a huge arm that can honestly fit any system. I don't think Josh McDaniels will have any trouble fitting him in this system, but you saw in 2019, Tom Brady didn't exactly have a huge year with these pretty much similar weapons around, same receiving core, same running back, everything like that. And Tom Brady, people say he kind of took a step back. He's getting old, but a lot of it is just that offense wasn't that good, plain and simple. So to throw Jarrett Stidham in there would be a tough task to tackle, and that is why I don't really buy that text message that Diana Rossini said. I think Cam Newton will be the starter week 1. It's just, I get that Jarrett Stidham does know that offense. He does have a hand up in that aspect, but I think it's tough. It's a tough sell to say that Cam Newton is not going to be the starter in that offense. And while they definitely might keep 3 quarterbacks, I think that is going to be a fairly regular thing in the NFL this year because of the COVID-19 pandemic going on. You know, teams are not going to be able to afford losing quarterbacks, especially if this gets in the quarterback room. They're going to be hoping and praying it doesn't spread to all of them. So it would not surprise me to see the Patriots or any other team continue to keep 3 quarterbacks on their roster this season, along with probably a 4th on the practice squad. But that does not change my opinion that Cam Newton will most likely be the starting quarterback for the Patriots. And as that kind of becomes set in stone, hopefully we'll get a better look at it in the preseason, even though the NFL did just announce there will only be 2 preseason games, which does make it a little bit more challenging for incoming quarterbacks such as Cam Newton to learn the offense and get some game reps. But anyways, here at the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, we want to take a look at this signing and the implications it could have on your fantasy team. Kind of where should Cam Newton be valued? What rounds is he really worth a pick? Because he hasn't played it since week 2 of the 2019 season. He is in a new system with a lot of question marks just going around the whole NFL season. So where is he worthy of taking a pick? And before we really get into what rounds he would be worthy of a pick or where you should take him in a fantasy football draft, let's take a look at, before his injury, the type of quarterback he was and the numbers he was producing. Because let's be honest, they were quite impressive and really one of the only quarterbacks in the league that it would be reasonable to take him relatively early in the draft. And if you take a look at his stats on Pro Football Reference, since his rookie year, just about every single season, he has thrown well above 3,000 yards. So that right there is getting you a handful of points. And on top of that, 2014 was his lowest amount of touchdowns thrown, which was 18. So you can imagine that he is going to be putting up numbers if he is healthy in this Patriot offense. And all signs point to him being completely healthy and 100% going into the 2020 NFL season. But one area where Cam Newton really turns to be a huge asset in the fantasy football world is the aspect he presents for your team on his feet. This guy can run. And the thing is with him is it's not like he's going to be he's not a run first quarterback. He wants to throw the ball, but when he needs to, he can do some damage on his feet and through the run game. So let's look a little bit at his running stats over the years. In his 8 years in the NFL, he is averaging 601 yards a season. And if you look at that, the lowest amount he has ever run in 2016 when he led the Carolina Panthers to the Super Bowl, he was rushing for 359 yards. And he has put up as high as 14 and as low as 4 rushing touchdowns in different seasons in his career. So this is a very dynamic quarterback when healthy, which I think he is. So this is just more fuel to the fire of why I have a hard time believing that Cam Newton is not going to be the starting quarterback for the New England Patriots from week 1. I mean, this guy is, when healthy, like I've said before, I think one of the top 10 to top 12 quarterbacks in this league. And now he's going and playing under 2 coaches in Bill Belichick and Josh McDaniels, who can really help him get back to his old form. And another aspect where he is really dangerous, that he really just adds to a whole team, is the run-pass option that a lot of quarterbacks do not give their offenses, and something that the New England Patriots have not had in a long time because of Tom Brady not being super dynamic on his feet. So it's just another thing to add to the equation when thinking of drafting Cam Newton to your fantasy football team. So before moving on, let's take a look at where we really can value a Cam Newton on the New England Patriots, which is something we obviously have never seen before, that does have a lot of factors driving it. You probably could argue that Cam Newton being the starting quarterback is not a 100% thing going into the season, but if we're going to be looking at his fantasy football value, let's just presume that he is starting over Jarrett Stidham and Matt Hoyer. And honestly, I do think he will be. I don't think you sign a talent like Cam Newton to have him ride the bench. So if we're looking at him as the starting quarterback for the New England Patriots, I could see him going fairly high if you are looking at his past production. However, you do have to take into consideration that he hasn't played in about 2 years, since he pretty much only played 2 games last season due to injury, and he has had a little bit of injuries, an injury history in the past. I know he's had a hurt ankle before, hurt shoulder, so that is something to take into consideration, and I think other fantasy owners will be taking into consideration when thinking of drafting Cam Newton. So obviously, something I will get into later on when I kind of dive in to my strategy as I go into a fantasy football draft. I am not big on drafting quarterbacks super, super high. I think you can get value later in it. I'm not going to get into in depth with that. But that does carry over into the fact that I don't think I would take Cam Newton in the first 5 rounds, especially with the current circumstances of his position. So looking at that and thinking about that, I also think that fantasy football owners around your league and just about every league are going to have these same question marks that you have about Cam Newton. But if he is a sell-sold starter for the New England Patriots, he's healthy going into the season, you could easily pick him up in the first 10 rounds and have a very, very productive quarterback at your hands, which is a big thing in fantasy football. If you can have a quarterback on top of receivers and running backs, and if you draft right in the first couple rounds or first several rounds and then get a productive quarterback in Cam Newton, you are going to be looking mighty fine as your fantasy football season carries through the year. So you will have to take into consideration and understand the risks that do potentially kind of present themselves with drafting Cam Newton. But in my opinion, you could have a reward really, really outweigh the risk. And that's why I think Cam Newton is worth a top 10 draft pick in your fantasy football team. I mean, you really have nothing to lose. You can pull up, you can get a different quarterback later that is going to start and has potential to produce for you if Cam Newton doesn't work out. But I think Cam Newton is going to be just fine on the New England Patriots and really has the potential to cement himself back in that top 10 to top 12 quarterback discussion. So there you have it. There is my look and kind of what I think of the very intriguing signing of Cam Newton by the New England Patriots. I mean, it's no secret how good the New England Patriots have been under Bill Belichick, and it's also no secret how good Cam Newton has been in this league the past 8 years. So that marriage has the potential to be very good, and that is my opinion on it. So I'm glad you guys listened. I'm going to take a break real quick, and coming up after the break, I am going to dive back into what I talked about last episode, a little bit more in depth of my strategy in a fantasy football draft.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines. They got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info. All right. Welcome back, everybody.
So we just went and talked about the Cam Newton signing to the New England Patriots and what that could look like, whether he's the starter, whether he's not the starter, and kind of how that may impact his fantasy football value, where to draft him, where to expect him to get drafted, and just kind of not reach for a player like Cam Newton because his potential is so high, but there are a lot of question marks as he enters his 10th season as an NFL quarterback. Coming up later on the show, we're going to be going over kind of the dynamic of a keeper and dynasty league and some top players to be targeting when drafting for a league like that. When you are able to keep a player for the long term, it's not just a one season type of thing as you draft these top guys. But right now, we are going to be talking about draft strategy. What to look for in what rounds, what positions do you want to stay away from, where do you want to draft certain players or certain positions. I talked about it very briefly in my last episode, and now I'm going to go a little bit more in depth and tell you my tips, my pointers on what I'm looking for as I'm drafting my own fantasy football team. One thing that I will say before giving you my tips is that this is just a preference thing. Not everyone likes it this way. This is just the way that I have always done fantasy football the past 10, 15 years. But I pretty much only play in points per reception leagues. So that is a receiver or a running back or a tight end. They get a point every reception they get. And I just think it kind of makes fantasy football more fun, more interesting. It gives a lot of people or a lot of players more value. Otherwise, without points per reception, everyone is just so touchdown dependent, and it makes it a lot more one-dimensional, as fantasy football is boring when it is. It just makes kind of the aspect of fantasy football a lot more one-dimensional, and as a preference for me, that is something I don't like. So these tips and pointers are going to be for a PPR league. That is one thing I want to get in front of because that is how I usually do it. So I'm going to be giving you my tips going into a PPR draft. So let's get to it. And this first one is by far the most talked about draft strategy in fantasy football. Some agree with it, some don't. It can be controversial depending on who you are talking to, but it is the obvious conversation of when to draft a quarterback. And I am of the belief, I am the type of person that waits as long as you can to draft a quarterback. And I will say it has gotten a little bit different the past couple of years with Patrick Mahomes and Lamar Jackson really coming onto the scene. And I mean, Patrick Mahomes is just a freak. He does everything. He puts up 25, 30 points a lot of the times every single week in and week out. And Lamar Jackson, you're pretty much getting a quarterback and a running back. He had Let's see. He had over 3,000 yards passing with 36 thrown touchdowns, as well as just over 1,200 yards on the ground and 7 touchdowns. So you are getting running back and quarterback production out of Lamar Jackson. And if you go back, I was talking about Patrick Mahomes earlier. Patrick Mahomes had over 4,000 yards in the air, as well as 26 thrown touchdowns in 2019. And you also can't forget his 50 thrown touchdowns in 2018. So Lamar Jackson and Patrick Mahomes do present a little bit of a special circumstance. If they either fall to or they are in your slot in the first round, those are the only quarterbacks I would ever understand taking in the first round. Other than that, I am big on waiting for quarterbacks. I'm talking seventh round to 10th round at the earliest. The way I like to do it is I like to pick my top receivers and running backs, and once I see one or two other people drafting quarterbacks, or the quarterbacks are kind of starting to fall off the board, that's when I go and try and get my quarterback, because you can get so many different quarterbacks later in the draft and still get value out of them. If you're getting 18 to 22 points out of a quarterback, you're going to be in pretty good shape. So a quarterback such as Deshaun Watson or Matthew Stafford, or maybe even Carson Wentz, a little bit risky with his injuries, or Jimmy Garoppolo, who I think could have a big year with the 49ers offense. Guys like that, you can wait later in the draft and still get value out of the quarterbacks. That's a position that I don't see really the worth in drafting them early unless your position is one of the ones that lines up with getting Patrick Mahomes or Lamar Jackson in the first round. So that one I do kind of make an exception for, but for the most part, wait to draft your quarterback. Another thing that is big when I am drafting my fantasy football team is I like or prefer to go running back early before receiver. Not that I'm totally against getting a receiver first round. You know, you can't go wrong with the Julio Jones, DeAndre Hopkins, those type of guys. But if I can, I like to get running backs early, especially playing in a points per reception league where getting a running back that is going to get you receptions out of the backfield is a huge bonus. So players like Ezekiel Elliott, Christian McCaffrey, Alvin Kamara, those type of guys are the really bread and butter of the PPR leagues, and they are the ones that have a great chance of helping you just get over that hump, because you're going to be able to get productive wide receivers in the second to fourth rounds that are really going to help your team. But running backs, it kind of falls off a little bit or a little bit more than it does so with receivers. And you'll see that, you can get very productive running backs that will really help you out of the backfield. But if you get those top guys early on that are going to get the points per reception in the passing game out of the backfield is a huge bonus. Another reason why I like or prefer to go running back first is also because the running backs that go early are the bell cows. The Saquon Barkley's, along with the three I just named earlier. And once it gets later, you get a lot of question marks with, it's such a big thing, a running back by committee in the NFL these days. Coaches like to have anywhere between 2 to 3 or 2 to 4 running backs that they can trust and they can give the ball to, or they'll have one running back from first to second down, and then they'll have a third down back that gets some of the attention out of the passing game. So it's just things like that if you can target a running back early and get on one early, that will really benefit your fantasy football team in a PPR league. One other thing that I like to point out in fantasy football drafts is a lot of people draft for need, and they go, okay, I'm going a receiver here, so I have to pick this. What I like to do is I get a list. I obviously don't list the whole league, but I get a list about the top 50 players, and I look at it, and I try and draft the best player available on that list when it is my turn. That way you're not going, oh my gosh, I need a receiver in the 6th round, but the best receiver right now is valued at the 10th round. You know, it just doesn't make sense to really push yourself in a position to kind of mess up, and it's those type of things when you don't want to be drafting for upside early on. You want to be drafting more reliable players who have had consistent production in the NFL as they have played. So don't try and reach too early just because you're trying to draft for need. Try and focus on the best player available and let the positions come to you. I get that sometimes it's a little easier said than done and you need that position and you don't really have a choice, but just try and go reliable before you start making the big jumps for the sleepers or who's the crazy upside that you can hopefully get production out of, or hopefully they be consistent this season, because sometimes it works out, but a lot of the times it really can handicap your league. So you want to just be careful, or your team, not your league, your team. So you want to just be careful when doing things like that for your fantasy football team. Another tip I would point out that some people like to pay attention to that I do not think is or should be a key contributor when drafting players is don't put too much emphasis on their matchups. If, this team has one of the easier schedules in the NFL, or they play in a division that has 1 to 2 teams that aren't very good and are automatic wins or potential to really go off for a certain amount of weeks. I try not to focus on that because, one, a reliable player in fantasy football is going to put up numbers no matter who they are playing. The people who are consistently putting up numbers, the Patrick Mahomes, Lamar Jacksons, DeAndre Hopkins, Julio Jones, and the list goes on and on, George Kittle, guys like that, they are going to be putting up big numbers pretty much every single team they play. Yeah, there's going to be some weeks where they aren't putting up as much. Something goes wrong in the game or right for them if they are a receiver and their team's running the ball a lot and it's working. There's things like that, just different factors that go into a football game that sure, there's going to be some bad weeks or just non-productive weeks in the fantasy football world, but try not to focus too much on matchups. And it kind of intertwines with the bye week. Bye weeks are very interesting in fantasy football, and this is one. I just told you not to go too much on matchups. And I also don't focus too heavily on bye weeks, but sometimes I will try and line up a couple people's bye weeks or a couple players' bye weeks just so that you're not losing a key player every single week, it seems like. If you have 1 or 2 weeks throughout the year that you're going to have 2 to 3 people out, it can almost kind of benefit you because that's just two, those weeks are going to be challenging. You're going to have to hit the waiver wire, but you at least just have 2 weeks. It's not like every other week you're trying to manage and figure out different aspects. So when drafting, I don't try and focus too much on matchups. And while I don't heavily rely on the bye weeks, it is something I pay attention to. And if it lines up and just works out, sure, it is great to have 1 or 2 weeks where you have a majority of your roster on a bye week, but it is also not something that I am completely dependent on as I draft my fantasy football team. Another one that is fairly obvious to go by is waiting on kickers and defenses. And most people do, obviously, but I'm talking your last, you shouldn't even touch a kicker or a defense until your last 4 to 5, your last 4 to 5 draft picks, to be honest, because one, realistically, you're not going to be getting that much value out of them, and you can be drafting other players later in those rounds, maybe like the 12th to 13th rounds, that have a chance to actually have some upside and actually give your team some value. And so that is a big kicker and why I usually wait as long as I can to get a defense or kicker. A lot of the times you'll see it later in the rounds where teams like the Ravens or the Niners or even the Patriots, kind of like top 3 defenses start going, and that is when I would pick my defense. I am very rarely, pretty much, I don't think I've ever been one to draft a defense first because you're just not going to be getting that much value, and I would rather have someone that could give my lineup some actual value while drafting instead of getting a defense early. Same with kickers. There's no real point in drafting a kicker early because who knows? There's so many different variables that can go into a kicker's game that it's just not worth rolling the dice on drafting a kicker early. As we go from kickers and defenses, I want to talk about another position that really can help your fantasy team in adding points every single week, and that is the tight end position. A lot of the times people wait for tight ends, which I don't completely blame that. I really don't. Obviously, if you can get a George Kittle, Travis Kelce, Zach Ertz type of guy in the early rounds, then yes, you should get them because those are the guys who are getting in the end zone while also putting up yards and big reception numbers for a points per reception league. But one aspect that I really try and do every single year that some people don't agree with as much, it's a little bit more of one of my controversial takes when drafting a fantasy football team. And that is, in my personal opinion, I like to get 2 tight ends because let's be honest, tight ends are a position that get targeted in the end zone and in the red zone. And that's where you get your points, is getting touchdowns. And so one thing that has been big for me in repeated years is having a very solid tight end and then also having another solid tight end that you can put in your flex position. I love having 2 tight ends on my rosters. Think of you have Zach Ertz, then you have Mark Andrews in your flex. I mean, those players are going to be putting up big points for you and getting in that end zone a lot. So if you can get 2 tight ends and manage to get one in the flex for a team that really targets their tight ends. So you got, like I said, the names I listed before in Kittle, Kelsey, Ertz, Andrews, even someone like Austin Hooper or David Njoku on the Browns. So it's players like that you can really target. And some of those tight ends you're going to be able to get towards the later or second half of your fantasy football draft. So that's something to keep an eye out for because I am big on trying to get 2 tight ends on my team that can produce for me. And a lot of people, which I understand, are not too big on that. And now, as we kind of tie it back to what I was saying earlier in this part of the podcast. So I said, if possible, I like to get a productive running back early on, mainly in the first round if I can. But those rounds 2 to 4 is where I really try and hone in and focus on my receiving core. Because a lot of times you play in a 2 to 3 receiver league. So you want a big group of receivers that can contribute for you. And in the PPR league, it's why it's important to get a running back early on and then go to receivers because the receivers are going to consistently be getting thrown the ball to. Running backs, there's only a handful that you can get in the first round that are going to get the ball often in the passing game. So once you get that running back, focus on receiving core for the next couple rounds and get really dependable receivers that are going to produce every single week. And of course, just about everything I'm talking about will also relate back to value and not reaching too much. That's when you really got to put on the GM cap and look at, okay, is it worth taking this receiver in the 4th round who's rated 6 to 7? Or should I stick with this running back who is in the 4th round value range? And should I just get him to stay with that, which I completely understand and I would advise. But if possible, try and stick with the receiving core in the earlier rounds after you get a running back. And then in like the 5th to 7th round, that's when I would usually go quarterback. So that's how I usually like to line up my fantasy drafts, if possible. Obviously, you got to be thinking on the fly, knowing what you're going to do, have a game plan for what happens. But you got to have that GM cap ready and be able to make those value decisions in a short amount of time to make sure that your fantasy football team shapes up to be the best possible team you can have. So as I'm giving you some points and tips to look at when you're drafting your fantasy football team, I talked about waiting to get a quarterback, trying to get a productive running back who preferably produces in the passing game as well in that first round. Not that a receiver is bad in the first round because it's great, but if you can, a running back in the first round, try and focus on the receivers in the 2 to 4, 2 to 5 range. And then a big one for me is also that 2 tight end strategy. I think that is huge in fantasy football. It's a strategy that I have a lot of fun with because tight ends are fun to root for and that they really get in the red zone and get targeted there, which is important in fantasy football. There's also the obvious ones of don't go too heavy on who the team is playing or who the players are playing. You can focus on that once you have the players and you're trying to pick your team, who's the better matchup. But when you're drafting, don't look at the schedule too much. Unless it's a bye week, you can kind of try and stack some bye weeks. But other than that, it's really not worth it. It's such a minor aspect in the fantasy football world that focus on the player and the value where you're getting him. Is it the right pick there? This is supposed to be a fun experiment, and that's where my last thing is. My last tip, my last pointer is to have fun with it. You're doing fantasy football to have fun. You're not some big businessman. Take some risks. Once you get in a little bit of the later rounds, pick a rookie. Pick someone who you think has a chance to be that breakout sleeper in the league. I wouldn't pick rookies too high. Now, let me fall back on that one a little bit. Don't get myself in trouble because obviously it can be difficult to predict which rookie is really going to produce. They have to have the talent, but also they have to be in the right fit. So wait until it's kind of the later rounds and you say, you know what, let's take some risks, let's have some fun, let's bet on someone that we believe in. Or maybe that's when you say, hey, my favorite team, in like the 12th or 13th round, you say, hey, my favorite team drafted this guy, let's go with him, let's hope for him to really ball out and that can produce for us. So once it gets later in the rounds, yeah, take some risks, have fun with it, just make sure you're making the right and smart decision during your fantasy football drafts, because that is really what's going to take you over the edge and help you produce as a fantasy football owner. So I hope here at the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, you just got some good tips and pointers that you're going to be taking with you as you enter into your fantasy football season. Because let's be honest, folks, we are not that far away. It is July now. Teams are reporting to camp this month. So we got to start gearing up and thinking about what our fantasy football teams and drafts are going to look like. So there are my pointers. There are my tips. Coming up after the break, we're going to take a little look into keeper and dynasty leagues. What kind of is that exactly? What goes into it? And what players would I be targeting for a keeper and dynasty league that I could have on my team for a long, long time? So stick around after the break and we will get after it once again.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA. From the UFC to extreme cage fighting, they got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Alrighty, welcome back everybody, and thank you for listening to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. We talked about the Cam Newton to the Patriots signing earlier in the episode. We also went over my tips for drafting, really in general, but also emphasis on a points per reception league. And now we're going to take a little dive into what it takes to be in a keeper league, the different aspects a keeper league presents, and then some of the top players to really shoot for going into a keeper league this season. Because keeper leagues, let's be honest, are a little different. They're when you are able to keep a certain amount of players, usually 1 to 2 players every single year for the next year. So it's a little bit, it's almost like the most any of us will feel to being a real life NFL general manager, because you have to make certain decisions that are going to help your team in the long run. Trades throughout the season become a little bit riskier because you don't want to trade away someone who's going to have a breakout season and then all of a sudden you're like, oh dang, that could have been my keeper. And so just the drafts are a little bit more important. One bad draft can hurt you for a couple of different years. Trades are a little bit different in a keeper league. So let's get to it. So like I said, NFL keeper leagues or fantasy football keeper leagues, you get to choose a player or two at the end of the season that stays on your roster for that next year. And so one interesting aspect in a keeper league is that it makes rookies a lot more valuable, because usually you draft rookies later on in the draft and you're just like, oh, hopefully it's kind of a little up in the air It's a risk, but with keeper leagues, those top rookies become a lot more valuable. If you can get the rookie of the year, top 2 to 3 rookies, it can potentially really boost your team going into the future. So rookies do become more valuable. Every draft is just more valuable in a keeper league because of what a keeper league presents. 2 aspects that I think are important when joining a keeper league is 1, you want to make sure you are joining a keeper league that has players that actually or really know football. Keeper leagues can make it a little bit more challenging because there's a lot more to maneuver around a keeper or dynasty league. So you want to make it sure to make it the most competitive as possible. It's a league that has people who are really following the NFL closely and kind of know what exactly they want and what they're looking for. Another thing, the league size. You don't want a 14-person league. Honestly, even a 12-person league can be kind of a lot for a keeper because that just takes away a lot of different players, and you want to at least be able to have a certain amount of players available that will keep teams competitive year in and year out. So a 10-person league would be ideal. Obviously, 12-person is doable, but the 10-person would be the most ideal in my opinion. And another reason why rookies are so important in keeper leagues or just so crucial is because a lot of the time, every player has a certain value. Every player is a certain round pick. So let's say Saquon Barkley is a first-round pick or someone is a second-round pick. Usually if you keep, let's say Saquon Barkley is a first-round pick and you keep that player, that means you usually don't draft in that round. So that's your first round pick. But a reason why rookies can be such an advantage is because if you draft a rookie in the 10th round and that's one of your keepers, well, look at you. What do you know? You have a huge value pick. You get 1st through 10 draft rounds, and you also get someone who is a huge contributor on their team. So it's another reason why drafting people for value in the late rounds is huge in a keeper league. So, like, for example, let's say last year you draft Deebo Samuel of the 49ers or Josh Jacobs of the Raiders. You could get a really value pick. Well, let's be honest, Josh Jacobs was getting drafted a little higher than Deebo Samuel at the beginning of the season last year just because everyone knew he was going to be the main guy in that Raiders offense. But you get what I'm saying. The later value rounds can really help you out in a keeper league because you lose that draft pick in the later rounds and you get to keep your early picks, and it will benefit you when drafting for your keeper league. One thing I want to clarify now that I've been talking that I realize I kind of made a little bit of a mistake. A dynasty league is when you keep the whole entire team and you pretty much are only drafting carryovers or rookies, which still make rookies very important. But what I'm talking about is a keeper league, and keepers are when you get to keep anywhere between usually like 1 to 3 or 1 to 4 players every single year. And then you draft what's left over, and each player has a round value, and you lose that draft pick. So that is what I'm talking about. Dynasty leagues are a little different. Wanted to clarify that before we continued on with keeper leagues. So now that you get the gist of what a keeper league is, I'm going to be going over some players that are worth your while in a league like that, are going to give you value not only in the first round. We'll talk about some first round guys that you're going to want to keep in a league like that, but also later in the rounds, maybe the 5th round to 6th round, as well as what rookies are going to be putting up offensive numbers that are really going to be able to benefit you in something like this. So obviously you have your running backs like Christian McCaffrey, Saquon Barkley, Alvin Kamara, even Dalvin Cook. Those 4 guys are players who I would want to keep in a keeper league. Yeah, you're going to lose your first round pick, but the fact of the matter is you are most likely going to be getting first round value out of those players every single year. So it's nice to have a reliable player like that. Now, where it gets a little tricky is in the 2 to 4 round range with people like Nick Chubb or Chris Carson, and you're going to have to be picking and choosing if they are really worth keeping / drafting in a league like that. You obviously have your Travis Kelce's or George Kittle, who if you get in the 2nd to 3rd round, that probably will be worth keeping because a tight end who can produce the numbers that they do is huge. And obviously, if you're listening this far into the episode, you know how much I enjoy having tight ends, especially reliable ones, on my roster. So as we go into in depth about a keeper league, one person that I like to keep an eye on who probably realistically would go in between rounds 3 and 5 is Kenny Golladay of the Detroit Lions. And you might wonder why. Some people might not have as much faith in the Detroit Lions, but if you look at his numbers, he puts up consistent numbers every single week. He is one of the most underrated receivers in the NFL, in my personal opinion. And the Detroit Lions are really a pass-heavy team. And Matt Stafford has shown every single year, if he has the tools around him, he can be a top quarterback in the league. So a guy like Kenny Golladay will continue to put up points. And also, you don't have to lose your first or second round pick. You could get him a little bit later, still pretty early, but a little bit later, and get a lot of value out of a receiver like Kenny Golladay. Little bit of a sleeper now moving forward for a keeper league. A name that really busted on to the scene later in the season, especially the playoffs, is running back for the San Francisco 49ers, Raheem Mostert. And the reason why is you could probably get this guy in the, I'm going to guess, 7 to 10 round range, if not even a little later, because people are going to be skeptical about, one, how much of a running back by committee that Kyle Shanahan runs, but he showed when he has a dependable running back that he believes in, that produces as how Mostert did at the end of the season, he's going to pound the rock with that guy. And I think people are going to wait a little bit on him just because they aren't exactly sure. And if he produces anywhere near he did in the playoffs or the end of last season, you have a steal in a keeper league because he is a, honestly, top 15, top 20 performer in the NFL. And if you could get him in the 7 to 10 round range, that is a huge win for your fantasy football team. Another aspect of keeper leagues, if you have if you have 1 to 2 keepers, this probably isn't the position you're going to be choosing to hold on to, but the quarterback position. A lot of people wait later and later and try and get maybe a Kyler Murray or a Dak Prescott a little later on that are still going to be able to produce, and you get to save a round. That's if you get to keep 3 to 4 players. Keeping a quarterback that's productive, they can do both on their feet and through the passing game, is a big thing in a keeper league. So that is one aspect to keep an eye on. But you got to bring up Dak Prescott. You also have to realize that there's contract situations in the NFL. Dak is going into his final year of the contract, so you are taking a little bit of a risk with players like Dak because who knows if he's going to be in Dallas or another team. You never know the landing spot. So you do run the risk of keeping someone as they change into a system, and that can be bad, but that could also really benefit you as a fantasy football owner. So it's just the options you have to weigh when looking at a player like that, and options you just have to weigh in a keeper league. When you're going to be holding on to people, contract situations become a little bit more important. And breakout players are also an interesting thing to keep an eye on in keeper leagues. So, for example, I'm big on Chicago running back David Montgomery. I think he's going to be the number one guy this year in Chicago in the backfield and has a chance to really break out. But another thing you have to take into consideration on a keeper league, you got to be careful with one season wonders, one hit wonders. Is this someone who's going to continue to produce at a high level? Now, I'm high on David Montgomery, so I'm not saying he's not going to continue to produce, but it's just another thing you have to be careful of, and you have to value certain players at certain spots and run the risk. Is it worth keeping him at certain rounds? And that's a player who, if you have big value with, you're probably going to be able to get him into some of the later rounds, and it could be worth it. But it's just something to pay attention to when you are in a keeper league. There's a lot of different aspects that you really need to be focusing on, and that's why it goes back to what I said. To make it more competitive and more fun for a fantasy football owner, you want to kind of do a keeper league with people who know what they're doing and know the NFL, because if you don't, it's just going to make it a little bit more challenging and add some extra layers to the keeper league. But now, as we move forward, I want to talk a little bit about rookies in a keeper league, because rookies often aren't drafted in the first 5 rounds in the NFL fantasy football draft, because it's kind of a big question mark on how they're going to produce. But I want to go over some guys that you can get in the 8 to 12 round range, if not even a little later, that might be a first or second round pick later on in their career, and you have this guy at a later value. Well, it might change a little bit as their careers progress if you're in a long-term keeper league, but on it now, it's going to help you in the short term for a keeper league. So the first rookie I would want to take a look at is Jonathan Taylor, Indianapolis Colts running back out of Wisconsin. He was a Heisman Trophy candidate, I think 2 or 3 years at Wisconsin, big time rusher every single season there. And now he's going into just a really improving Colts team, a good fit there. They have a really good thing going with that offense now with Phillip Rivers, and also, can't forget, they have one of, if not the most dominant offensive lines. So now they have a consistent 3-down back. That could be someone who is a huge value, not only in a keeper league, in any other fantasy league, but for a keeper, it could be huge. The next one, first-round draft pick, Henry Ruggs out of Alabama for the Las Vegas Raiders. He showed what he can do in college. He is a absolute speedster, a crisp route runner, and I think someone who is going to come straight into the league and be the Las Vegas Raiders' #1 receiver. I know they have Tyrell Williams, but this guy, Henry Ruggs, is a stud. So that is another guy who, obviously, receivers, I'd be shocked if he goes very high, but you're going to be able to get him for a value pick and be able to continue keeping someone at a later round for the keeper leagues, which is huge and can really benefit you in the long term, because one bad draft can really hurt you in a league like this. But if you draft these guys, I think you could be in really good shape. One last rookie to pay close attention to. Didn't get as much love coming into the season as some of these other bigger names or first-round picks are. He's kind of flying a little bit under the radar. That is Brandon Ayuk out of Arizona State, who was drafted in the first round by Kyle Shanahan and the San Francisco 49ers. And that name I just said right there, head coach Kyle Shanahan, is a big reason I'm putting Ayuk into this category as a top rookie receiver for keeper leagues. He's a name that you're going to be able to get late in the draft, and also I think could be a big-time producer for this offense. Emmanuel Sanders is gone, so that puts him right into the #2 spot behind Deebo Samuel. And Kyle Shanahan is one of, if not the best, offensive-minded head coaches in the NFL right now. So to put him in that, where Kyle Shanahan always finds a way to put his players in really good positions to succeed, especially receivers, he finds open field. And this guy is a yards-after-catch monster. So that is why I'm a big believer in Brandon Ayuk being a huge, huge benefit for a keeper league. So those are the 3 rookies, Jonathan Taylor, Henry Ruggs, and Brandon Ayuk. There's a couple more. Do your research, do your homework. It'll pay off because rookies are big in a keeper league. So there you have it for keeper leagues. I gave you a little bit of insight on what goes into them, what makes them so unique, some pointers. It's an interesting thing to really go into. They're fun, though, I will say, because it's really, you have to make very big decisions in a way, and it makes you put on the NFL GM hat of what is really going to be helping you not only this season, but the long run, since the keeper league can go on for a long-term period. So you got to be careful with who you're drafting, who you're trading for, and what players you are choosing to keep. Because if you can get some later round keepers and their draft picks are later on, and then you can stack your team with the front end of the draft, you're going to be in really good shape for a long time. And it's going to make you have some tough decisions, but good decisions to make. So that is one thing to pay close attention to in your keeper leagues. So thank you for making it this far in the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. Stay tuned, and after the break, we are going to be taking a look at some players that might have been good in the past, but that I would try to avoid in a fantasy football league this year. So stay tuned, and that is what we're going to be talking about after the break.
Check out the show built around the women of MMA. From the UFC to the extreme cage fighting, we got the fights covered. Listen, it's the Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast. The latest news of upcoming fights, discussions of previous matches. Join us as we talk to and about the biggest names in women's mixed martial arts, past, present, and future. When it's the women's fight game, you know where to listen to. The Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast.
All right. Welcome back, everybody, and thank you for making it this far with me into the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. We went over the Cam Newton to the Patriots news, as well as a draft strategy going into your fantasy football draft. We even went over some keeper league aspects, and now to end the show, I'm going to be telling you some players that I would honestly avoid this fantasy football season. So here we go. The first guy I'm going to be talking about, and let's just be clear, it doesn't mean none of these guys are good or they're not going to be producing this season. But if we're going to be talking about this next guy in Alvin Kamara of the New Orleans Saints, some of you might be going, what the heck? Why are you saying that, Grady? Well, let's just be clear. He's a first-round draft pick, of course. He's a top 5 fantasy football draft player. Arguably, he is. The thing is I just have some questions about him. I do. You don't know if he's going to be that number one guy, or are they going to do a running back by committee? Is he going to be able to handle a number one guy? He's kind of nimble. He's smaller. So it's just some question marks, and I personally would like to avoid question marks in the first round. So it's not might not be a popular choice, but that is one that I would honestly kind of steer clear from. Obviously, you can't go wrong. He's going to put up some numbers this year. But if I had the choice, I would pick some other people over Alvin Kamara. That's just my personal opinion. And we're going to stick to the running back position for now. Another person who showed you how much of an animal he is last season, especially in the playoffs, is Derrick Henry of the Tennessee Titans. And while he has been a beast for fantasy owners in the past, and there is a good chance he still will be, but can he really put up the numbers he did later in that season for 17 games? Football is a brutal sport, as we all know, and it's hard to stay healthy and stay up into that tip-top shape all 17 games, especially when Derrick Henry is pretty much that entire offense. The Tennessee Titans do not have much going for them on offense aside from Derrick Henry. So is he really going to be able to carry the ball 20 to 30 times a game like he was in the playoffs and producing as he did in the playoffs? Just another question mark. Now, I don't think he's going to be a first-round pick, and I don't think you can go wrong with him, but personally, that is just another player that I would try to avoid this fantasy football season, especially because of his performance in the playoffs. His value is probably going to be a little higher than I would like. People are going to be drafting him a little higher than normal, and that would make me kind of uncomfortable to be taking Derrick Henry. So now I gave you some big names just right there, Derrick Henry and Alvin Kamara, that I would kind of maybe stick away from. Here's a not so big name, might be a little more obvious, like, oh yeah, I would try to avoid him, is Darius Geis from the Washington Redskins. Not only has he been hurt pretty much his whole career with knee injuries, so he's not too dependable in that aspect, as well as one thing to take into consideration is that they have a loaded running back committee now in Washington, with Adrian Peterson, Antonio Gibson, and now J.D. McKissick as kind of their third down back. So I honestly see Darius Geis as a possibility to be cut in the preseason because he just hasn't shown the dependability that you need in the NFL. And so I could see them kind of cutting ties with Darius Geis. So I would be wary of thinking he could be maybe a sleeper or a big-time performer this year. So I would avoid him in your drafts because, maybe down the line if he does start performing, great. Then you have someone who you can pick up on the waiver wire, or you got in like the 15th or 16th round. But be careful of thinking him as a sleeper in the earlier rounds. I would be careful about Darius Geis. Another running back I would try to avoid, and it's not because I don't like him. He's actually one of my top players in the league. I really like watching him play, and I'm rooting for him. He seems like a great guy. He's been through a lot, and that is James Conner of the Pittsburgh Steelers. That is one I would kind of avoid. And maybe you can get him later in the draft. And if he's like your running back 3 or 4, that's different. But taking him early and thinking that he could be your running back 1 or 2, I would just have some concerns over his really durability. Can he really hold up as that number 1 guy for an entire season? He hasn't exactly shown that yet. And when you're looking at someone for a running back 1 or 2 or even wide receiver 1 or 2, you obviously want someone who doesn't have an injury history, someone who you can depend on that they're going to be playing the far majority of the season, especially in such a physical sport. And so that is one reason I would kind of steer away from James Conner of the Pittsburgh Steelers. We have been heavy running back in this segment, and now we're going to go over to the receiver position. And this guy was huge for some teams last year, or for some fantasy football owners, because he had a lot of big games for his team. But I'm going to go with Cooper Kupp of the Los Angeles Rams. And the reason for that is if you look at his stats last year, it was very early heavy. The first 9 weeks, he was great. And then they had their bye. And then they kind of changed philosophies, and Robert Woods came along, and the whole offense was heavy Robert Woods, and Cooper Kupp's production went way, way down. And I don't think Cooper Kupp could be the number 1 guy consistently for the Rams and Jared Goff. And so that is why Cooper Kupp is someone who I wouldn't really look to depend on a lot in the fantasy football world. Obviously, like I said about James Conner, if you can get Cooper Kupp as your wide receiver 3 or 4, that's great. But I think people hype up Cooper Kupp, especially in a points per reception league, because they think he's going to do very well there, and they try and draft him a lot earlier. People think he's like a top 10 receiver, and I do not have him in that production. So just be careful when drafting a player like that. It goes back to what I was talking about in draft strategy with all these guys. It's not that these guys are bad players and they're not going to have good games, because they are, but you have to realize the value that these guys present, and you have to draft correctly in value, and that is what is going to help your fantasy football teams really stay to the consistently at the next level, staying in your value range and drafting guys correctly. One final receiver in my list of players to be careful of drafting and kind of avoid is Sterling Shepard of the New York Giants. I just think that is kind of a crowded offense with Darius Slayton could be kind of a breakout guy this year. You have dependable Golden Tate, who is going to be the number 1 guy. He's going to be getting most of their targets. And then on top of everything, they are a run-first offense with one of the best running backs in the league, Saquon Barkley. So it's just another pick that I would be kind of questionable over, especially when, not that I'm not big on Daniel Jones, but he is just yet to prove what he can do. So first off, you have a lot of other weapons around you, and then you have a young quarterback who is yet to show that he can be a consistent force in the NFL throwing the football. It's just a lot of question marks around Sterling Shepard that I would kind of try and avoid and wouldn't really focus on him as much. We are going to head on over to the quarterback position for the first time in this draft. And I'm going to give you someone who there's been seasons where he has been consistent. He has put up numbers, but this year I would just be very careful on drafting him, and that is Kirk Cousins of the Minnesota Vikings. He still has Adam Thielen, but he is losing Stephon Diggs as they traded him to the Buffalo Bills. So that is a big loss because that really was their most talented wideout. He does have a good tight end in Kyle Rudolph, but he hasn't been very dependable. And first and foremost, they are a run-heavy team. Dalvin Cook has showed to be one of the better offensive running backs in this league. So while I do think Kirk Cousins could be productive, I just don't see him being anything more than a game manager in the NFL. And when you're looking at a fantasy football quarterback, you want a little bit more than that. You want someone who has a good receiving core around him as well as a running back, which he does. I will give him that. But it's just not worth it to me to draft Kirk Cousins, especially if he might be valued a little higher than you have him. One other receiver that I actually just kind of realized I meant to talk about earlier, and this is going to take some of you guys by surprise, that I would kind of avoid is Mike Evans of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Yes, he has Tom Brady as his quarterback. Yes, their team is going to be a lot better than they ever were. However, he has a lot more weapons around him. He has Ronald Jones, I think, could have a big year at running back. They have Chris Godwin. They have Cameron Howard, and now they have Gronkowski, who you know Tom Brady is going to look to find early and often. There's just a lot of weapons around him. So while I do think Mike Evans will have a good year, you have to be careful on where you're going to be drafting him, because that is someone who is going to be a man amongst a lot of different weapons. So especially he is someone who people are going to be targeting early. I do not see him as a second or third round value in this year's fantasy football drafts. So just be careful of where you draft him if you're going to draft him. And that's what a lot of these players are going to come down to, which I will get to. But those are guys that I would just be careful about, especially Mike Evans. You never really know. One other one, and talking about Tom Brady, we're going back to his old team, is Julian Edelman of the New England Patriots. Their whole offense kind of scares me. I know we talked about Cam Newton, and he could elevate that offense a good amount and be a productive quarterback, but Julian Edelman will probably be the second or third guy. They have Mohamed Sanu, who Cam Newton has been seen working out with recently, so he's developing a relationship there. And then they also have N'Keal Harry, who was kind of quiet in his rookie year, but they have high hopes for. So I just think Julian Edelman will be no more than a slot. And that, I mean, he's a good slot. Can't take that away from him. But we just have to be careful on kind of where he's going to be valued, especially taking into consideration that he was valued higher with Tom Brady because of their relationship and the chemistry that they had. Cam Newton is going to be a whole different ballgame. Who knows? We said earlier in this episode it could be Jared Stidham. I think it's going to be Cam Newton, but either way, Julian Edelman is someone who be careful of, because his ADP might not be where some people in your league are drafting him, and I would just be careful on someone like that. Another big-time name who I would look to avoid is running back Le'Veon Bell of the New York Jets. And yes, he's going to be a reasonable, probably pretty solid running back 2, running back 3, but he's never going to get back to that value that he had in Pittsburgh, in my opinion. And if you are listening to kind of the offseason scuttlebutt, Adam Gase recently said, well, not recently, it was at the scouting combine, that he wants to give a lighter load to Le'Veon Bell in 2020, and that's after Le'Veon Bell saw the fewest touches in a non-injury season since his rookie year. He still had decent numbers, but I think the days of him being a running back 1 are over, and that's why I would kind of look to avoid him, or at least look to slow the roll and kind of see where he's being valued at among your league, and then go from there, because I don't see him putting up running back 1 numbers like he did in Pittsburgh. Now, this has been a heavy running back list, and honestly, that's going to continue here. This is someone who I have stayed away from. I'm sorry about that. This is someone I have stayed away from for the past 2 to 3 years, and that is Todd Gurley, who was with the Los Angeles Rams, but now is with the Atlanta Falcons. And I really get why you might want him. He's a big name. He's had a lot of success in this league, and he's on a new team. So you might think, okay, he's going to be the number one guy. Maybe he will get back to his ways. But his health is just not something I can trust. And who knows if he's ever going to get back to that 100% health point. Whenever or since ever he got hurt around that Super Bowl with the Los Angeles Rams, his running style has just not looked the same. And I don't think he's going to be valued at more than a running back 2 in fantasy football leagues this year. But even then, do you really want to be running the risk of having someone who isn't going to be reliable and potentially hurt? I mean, running backs' knees, that's a big part of your body for a running back, obviously, really any athlete. But cutting and everything, I just don't know if I would trust Todd Gurley moving forward in the 2020 NFL season. We're going to go back to the wide receiver position and back to the NFC West. And someone who I would kind of avoid is Tyler Lockett of the Seattle Seahawks. I just think in fantasy football, Russell Wilson is a top NFL quarterback, but he spreads it around. He does not key in on one guy. He's similar to like Aaron Rodgers, where they find all of their receivers at different points of their game. I think DK Metcalf is going to have a big leap in his second year, so that's going to take away from Tyler Lockett's targets. And then they also got veteran Greg Olsen at tight end now. They have Will Dissly also at tight end, who before his injury in his rookie year last year really looked like he could give Rookie of the Year a run for the money. So I think that he just has a lot of weapons around him in Tyler Lockett that I wouldn't really be big on drafting him early or as this number one wide receiver in Seattle, because I don't quite think it's going to pan out that way. Seattle is an offense that can be really good and is really good and produce because they have a lot of weapons, but that can also be kind of hard to predict in the fantasy football world. One final player to round out my people to be kind of just careful on drafting in your fantasy football drafts is Hunter Henry of the Los Angeles Chargers, tight end. Not that he hasn't been good in his NFL career, because he has been, but looking back on it, he really has not played a full season yet. He's been injured a lot during his season. I mean, he missed the entire 2018 year. So it's just someone who I think he can be a contributor, but you lose Phillip Rivers, you lose Melvin Gordon. There's just you have a rookie quarterback probably at some point coming in, Justin Herbert. You do have Tyrod Taylor. They've been very keen on saying that they're big on Tyrod Taylor, but I'm sure Justin Herbert is going to see his fair share of reps, in my opinion. And that is just something, there's just a lot of question marks around Hunter Henry, in my perfect opinion. So that's why I would kind of be careful of avoiding him. And let's be honest, I've been straight up, these aren't guys who I don't think will be good. It's not like they're bad picks, but you just have to be careful on where you're picking them, because it can be a little risky with some of these players at certain spots in the fantasy football draft. So just kind of be wary and focus on where you're drafting these guys. So everyone, I really appreciate you guys listening. I hope I gave you some good advice, whether it was your draft strategy, whether you're looking at guys who can be keepers in your keeper league, even the Cam Newton aspect of this episode, just kind of wondering where he's going to be valued, if he's going to be the starter, as well as players I would avoid. So once again, I am your Thursday and Sunday host, Grady Duggan, and I thank you for listening to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like, of course, to ask that you would please remember to subscribe to our show, write a nice review. It really helps us out. Also, if you have these social media platforms, go on, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and it will just be a big help as we really try to grow this network. And thank you, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.